Oh, this is gonna be crazy.
Okay, destroy the building.
Alright, so hello everyone and welcome today to another episode of SpraynPray1000's Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today I'm going to review the rather interesting, rather short, but rather unique game, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. Now, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse is another game in the Kirby series, and similar to most other Kirby games, it is a 2D side-scrolling platformer. Basically, you play as Kirby, and you navigate this environment by going either up or down or around objects and fighting enemies and whatnot. Except that this game is a little bit different from the usual Kirby formula. Usually in a Kirby game, you know, Kirby can fly infinitely, he can absorb other powers from other monsters that he eats, and, you know, generally you have a lot of control over Kirby's, you know, various degrees of movement, you know, and stuff like that. He has slide maneuvers and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the case. In this game, which is pretty similar to another game called Kirby's Canvas Curse, you play as Kirby. However, Kirby by himself is stuck in a ball-like form, and he cannot maneuver himself as is. You can actually not do anything as Kirby alone. And in fact, this game is navigated entirely from the touchscreen the second you boot it. The buttons on the controller are just completely negligible, and they don't do anything at all. So this is where the difficulties of the game really come into play, because now you have to navigate Kirby along these various pathways by tapping him to make him dash, by drawing rainbow rope that will, you know, he'll automatically follow along, and he'll eventually launch himself off of, and, you know, just generally using that to either maybe make him do a 180, have him navigate through something very dangerously, you know, as you draw it with the stylus for the gamepad. And it's a pretty interesting concept. And the one thing that I will say right off the bat about Kirby and the Rainbow Curse is that the animation, the graphics of this game are gorgeous. The entire game is basically rendered in claymation. And everything looks like it was made out of clay, like it was constructed using clay. And that is actually pretty interesting. I like that about this game, that it looks like it was constructed by, you know, various different things of clay, and just the colors and everything give this game a really unique and interesting feel to it. It gives it a really cool a really cool design and a really interesting world. It makes the world look very vibrant, you know, not hyper realistic or anything, but it has a very nice art style, very vibrant, and I like that. The second thing that I will say is that Kirby and the Rainbow Curse has some of the best music I've heard in a game in any kind of recent memory. And now when I say that, you know, I remember, you know, earlier this year in one of my first verdicts, I said that Smash Bros. For Wii U has one of the best soundtracks, but the thing is, its soundtrack includes a wide variety of games. You know, it's a little bit unfair because it's not really one game soundtrack, as opposed to an amalgamation and a combination of, you know, dozens upon dozens of different games remixed, and some of them left as is and stuff like that. This game has one of the best soundtracks I've heard in quite some time. The soundtrack gets a 10 out of 10 from me, and I really enjoyed it, along with the graphics. So the presentation part of this game is already pretty spot on. They did a really good job presenting this game, you know, making it look great, giving it a really good touch with the sound effects and the music. And I will give it a triple star, you know, 3 out of 3 stars, or whatever ranking you want to, you know, give it for that. The story, like usual, like most Kirby games, is pretty simplistic. Kirby loses his apple, as he's typically fond of eating various foods. But when he does so, 2 hands come and drain all the color and all the life out of Dreamland. And in order to restore it, a paintbrush wishes Kirby back to life, and the two of them set off to recover the color from the color thief. And basically, from there they go through 7 worlds. And like I said before, the story, I'm not expecting a dramatic and epic story out of a Kirby game. I'm going to be honest. Kirby is typically, a little bit more kid-friendly, a little bit more lighthearted, so I'm not expecting a dramatic storyline from it. So the story is all right. There's nothing really negative to say about it. Just it's simplistic. It gives incentive, whatever. The gameplay, and this is basically where most of the verdict is going to end up. The gameplay of this game is interesting, it's fun, but it has problems. And that is the unfortunate part about this game. This game lives and dies by its gameplay. Now, for starters, you navigate Kirby along this rope. As he goes from place to place, he'll automatically start to go along it. You can tap him to make him spin dash, which makes him move faster, and he can attack enemies in that way. And typically it's very interesting, how you have to navigate him around dangerous obstacles or dangerous objects. And sometimes Kirby can actually change his form. He can become a submarine that shoots torpedoes that you can then lead along the rope. He becomes a tank, which is basically you tap all over the screen to attack. You can make the tank dash. He can also become a rocket, which allows him to tackle people and move pretty quickly. And that's all cool and all. But the problem with those levels, with the vehicle levels, is that the level is largely built around the fact that you play as these various vehicles. The major problem arises when you play as these vehicles, and the levels are typically very short, very simplistic, and a lot of times very copy-pasted. There's not that many of these levels in the game anyway. Speaking of how there's not that many levels in the game anyway that make use of the various forms, the game itself is rather short. Each world, there's 7 worlds, and each world only has 3 levels in the main story. Now, that, at least for me, is pretty short for a Kirby game. I mean, the levels you could argue, are a bit longer than the average Kirby level, but ultimately, you could beat the game in probably one sitting if you were really devoted to it, and, just clear the story. Now, there is incentive to replay the various levels so you can get collectibles and pickups and other things to improve your score. And, just generally, give you a better ranking in the game overall. The thing about it is that the gameplay gets simple and repetitive. And when I say that, I mean, once you've kind of led Kirby along these lines, that you draw, the gameplay it doesn't really evolve anywhere beyond there. And usually, now you might say, well, usually in Kirby games, what do? You usually, you guide Kirby using the D-pad and you jump and whatever. But at least in those different games, you have all these various power-ups that you can sometimes even store inside of Kirby and, use them as needed. And just generally some levels, you play as Sword Kirby and, you're supposed to use Sword Kirby. Other levels you play as Fire Kirby. There's all these different abilities that Kirby can get. In this game, really, Kirby has no diversity, which is quite different. And I mean, that could be attributable to the fact that the gameplay is just so simple. Building off of Kirby Canvas Curse. But that is the problem I feel with this game, is that the gameplay gets too simple, too repetitive, and it doesn't really introduce anything new. So once you've played the first couple of worlds, you basically played the entire game, albeit with more difficulty towards the end. Especially given the fact that they reuse bosses. This game, they reuse the same bosses from earlier worlds, and with very little difference besides, maybe a little bit more difficulty. And, I mean, on one hand, I will say that the best part about this game is if you're a kid, if you're a really younger kid, this game is simple. It's easy for you to follow, it's nothing too complicated. It's basically a game meant for children, it's not something that is really meant to be taken too seriously, but I'm not here to review games for kids. So, one thing I will say for sure is if you have a younger sibling or a cousin or something and you want them to play some Wii U and, you want them to be fascinated by the colors and the simple gameplay and everything, by all means, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse is probably your game. It's simple. Kirby is, a very kid-friendly character, very cute. The gameplay is very easy to understand, and just generally a kid could probably go through the game and have little to no difficulties without a problem. However, unfortunately, the game itself really does not evolve too much beyond the first couple of worlds, and that's the one problem I have. Well, that's not the one problem, but sometimes the stylus, it's a little bit hard to control Kirby, especially in moments where you don't need to like do gigantic lines of rope, or you need to, just sometimes when you just need to do very simple movements that on a D-pad it would just be a simple tap and you'd be done. It's very hard to pull off on the stylus, especially if you want to draw a rope right under Kirby so he can start moving, as opposed to drawing a rope a little further out from him and launching him onto it. It becomes very annoying because sometimes you'll accidentally use the spin dash move. And in this game, the Kirby has his normal spin dash and then a big spin dash that he can only do once he gets 100 star points. And basically, stars are the pickups for this game. As you pick up 100 of them, you gain the ability to use this spin dash, which can break through big blocks, damage big enemies, and whatnot. And combine that with the fact that the gameplay gets pretty repetitive. I mean, it's a fairly simple experience that doesn't really go anywhere. The vehicle levels could have been really interesting, I feel, but they ended up being way too simplistic. You can't even turn around Vehicle Kirby to begin with, and most of them are side-scrolling, auto-scrolling levels. They're auto-scrolling platforming levels, which feels very awkward and weird in a game where you don't have that kind of precision over Kirby. In a Mario game, you control Mario by pushing left and right. It's very simple for you to plan out your next move, but in an auto-scroller, it's kind of difficult when you're forced to draw rope, so that Kirby can roll along. And you can't like draw 90-degree angles because Kirby will fly off. He won't be able to stay onto it. So you need to draw circles, which require a little bit more space, a little bit more leeway, and it becomes a little bit awkward at some points. Another thing I want to say is that you can cancel out rope by drawing a new line of rope through it. However, in some cases, it would just be simpler to let Kirby move by himself, again, because you don't have that kind of precision to give him a little nudge when you need him in certain narrow areas. It would be a lot easier if you could just eliminate all rope, period, which unfortunately you can't really do, because if drawing a line of rope to cancel out another line of rope means that you've drawn a line of rope to begin with, and you need to draw another line of rope to cancel out that line of rope, and etc., etc. You see where I'm going. And that is okay. There's nothing too major about that, but it's just annoyances that stem from this control scheme. Now, what I will say is that the main story, while it is short, the challenge mode is pretty long. The challenge mode has a lot to it. And I like that, at least there's there's something to do after you've mastered the main story or whatever, after you've beaten it. But unfortunately, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse kind of really falls down because it just doesn't implement too much. Now, the one thing I will say, or I guess the better word to say would be enough. Now, the one thing I will say is that the price point for this game was actually pretty good. The price point for this game was only $40. So that's as opposed to $60, that makes sense. But given the fact that the game already doesn't have, it doesn't have nearly that many levels, and the levels that it does have are simplified, short and sweet, and nothing too intensive, nothing you won't probably get on a couple of tries. The price point itself, maybe 30 would have been a better price point. I feel 40 is again kind of the pushing it, but I'm not too sure. So I do like that. I do like the presentation again, but the gameplay of this game is kind of what really buries it, where it fails, with very little room for anything like that. And unfortunately, I wish that, they had maybe some classic Kirby levels in there, I mean, don't get me wrong, they have classic Kirby music, but maybe a mix of some classic Kirby gameplay, and some of the levels, maybe it didn't have to be too long, keeping with the game. The game is majorly about, Canvas Curse style gameplay, but just something else, some more substance. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the game is short and the gameplay is repetitive, but for its length, it's not that bad. At least, the gameplay itself is more the problem than the length of the game. But you get it, again, you won't really get too much out of it at least compared to some of the other platformers that you have out there, which at this point are pretty numerous, like Donkey Kong, Super Mario, and other games along that. So Ultimately, what would I give Kirby and the Rainbow Curse? I will give it, some of the best scores. I want to give it, standing ovations, for its music and for its graphical design and what it does. But ultimately, as a whole package, the game is pretty weak. It's pretty flawed in some cases. And I just really wish they did a little bit more to really kind of like diversify the gameplay and to patch things up and maybe add in, more levels and more interesting gameplay. I'm going to give Kirby and the Canvas Curse a 72 out of 100. The one things I will say that really redeemed it and saved it from an even lower level are going to be the price point and, as I said, the music and everything else. But some parts of the gameplay really kind of damn this game, which is a little bit unfortunate. So that's going to be it for this edition of The Verdict. I'm SpraynPray1000. I'll see you next time for probably not for a full week or so, but it will probably be Type 0. I think Type 0 will be a pretty interesting game. And I'll see you guys there. So have a good one and take it easy.